Hi, my name is Grace Kendziorski, and this is the PowerPoint to my research paper, War Crimes and Evaluation of Dr. Josef Mengele. Hi, my name is... Before we dive into the war crimes he was accused of, first, a little background on Dr. Josef Mengele. In 1937, after graduating with a PhD in physical anthropology, Mengele became an assistant to Dr. Ottmar von Vuschauer. It was at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt Mengele cultivated his obsession with twins and the idea of eugenics in a pure race through the means of racial hygienics. Though it should be noted at this time, all experiments they conducted at the institution were humane. That same year, in 1937, Mengele joined the Nazi Party, and 1 year later enlisted in the army. Over the years, he served the Nazi army as a medical officer, and he slowly rose in rank. By November 1943, Mengele became the chief camp physician of Auschwitz II, also known as Birkenau. As chief camp physician, Mengele was given the freedom and license to kill whoever he wanted. In addition, he oversaw determining who would be sent to the gas chambers, who was fit to work, or who he would conduct his experiments on. He was known for his harsh selections that sent men, women, and children to the gas chambers with no condolence. It was with all this power he was able to continue conducting his experiments on twins and eugenics, only now as inhumanely as he pleased. Dr. Mengele performed his experiments on twins, often children, those with dwarfism, giants, and others with genetic variances he found interesting. At Birkenau, Auschwitz II, prisoners gave him the nickname the Angel of Death. It is believed Mengele experimented on about 3,000 twins, of which only 200 survived, although numbers vary. When it came to studying genetics and how it relates to disease, behavior, and an inferior race, Mengele believed twins were perfect for his research. He would use one twin as a control, while the other twin was subjected to any number of experimentations, including injections, amputations, and the purposeful exposure of diseases. If the twin was being experimented and died, the controlled twin would also be killed to do dissections and further study of the effects of the experiment. We know of Mengele's experiments due to the testimonies of survivors and the few records that were not destroyed by German officers getting rid of evidence as the Soviet soldiers closed in. The German experimenters kept extensive records of all of the experiments they did as a means of research, and so anything that the Soviets did find was extremely detailed and detailed all of Mengele's involvement. It should also be noted that Soviet soldiers, upon arriving at Auschwitz, did record many of the children that they found that Mengele had experimented in as evidence. To give an extent of how horrific Mengele's experiments were and how they are classified as war crimes, this is a picture showing an example of two twins that he forcibly had conjoined so that he could then do injections and experiments on, and days later they had died as a result of the experiments that he did on them. And most of the experiments he did were pseudoscience that had no clear objective and no real basis in scientific, and I thought that this picture and that story showed a great example of that, because what exactly is the point of forcing two people to become conjoined twins and then do injections? Because what is that exactly proving? As I stated before, Mengele did experiments on twins, dwarves, people with heterochromia, and other genetic diseases. And all of the experiments he did are classified as war crimes because of the following conventions, conferences, and treaties. In accordance with the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, civilians are to be treated humanely and fairly. These rights include those of freedom of religion, protection of family units to remain together, and communication of family members. And being that he was in charge of separating families by sending them to the gas chambers, hard labor, or experiments, that obviously does not keep the family units together, and the civilians were not treated humanely and fairly and had no rights. And in accordance with the First, Second, and Third Geneva Conferences of 1864, 1906, and 1929 respectively, they outlined the rights and protections of prisoners of war, which he violated horrifically with the assignments of death, hard labor, and evasive, painful experiments. The Third Geneva Convention of 1949 further elaborated on the rights of prisoners of war. It included the fair and humane treatment of POWs, including medical care, food, water, access to mail, payment for labor, custody of personal belongings, shelter, and immediate release at the end of the war. And obviously, in regards to medical care, his experiments did the opposite of that, when most received ill effects and even death. And then finally, the Nuremberg Code was created in response to Mengele's experiments and as part of the requirements of the Geneva Conventions. To break the code is a war crime. And since the code's inception, it has been the guideline of every subsequent experiment on humans. And the code states to perform any experiment on a human without their voluntary consent is a war crime. And even if the prisoners of Dr. Mengele did consent to the war crimes, it wouldn't count due to the extreme duress that they were under. So as for the actual involvement of Mengele, while he did not perform every experiment himself, being the chief camp physician, he did have much responsibility over the entire camp and as well as over the experiments, being that he did order them and ordered other physicians to do the experiments, as well as having his own hand in choosing and also executing the experiments. Ultimately, Dr. Mengele was never tried or brought to justice for his crimes. He should have been charged and was supposed to be, but he escaped. When the Soviet soldiers closed in on the camp, Mengele went west to avoid them. He was actually caught and in custody of the United States Army. But because Mengele had no SS blood group tattoo and the U.S. soldiers who caught him did not realize he was a war criminal, he was released. After evading capture by the United States Army, Mengele lived in Bavaria as a farmhand from 1945 until 1949. From there, he emigrated to South America, first settling in Argentina. Many post-war courts were looking for Mengele as his war crimes were thoroughly documented. One such court was the International Military Tribunal, as well as the UN War Crimes List and the Crocas List. And a result, in 1959, a warrant was sent for his arrest. But after Adolf Eichmann was captured in Buenos Aires in 1960, Mengele moved to Paraguay and then Brazil. Ultimately, Mengele avoided capture his whole life and died of a stroke and drowning while swimming in Brazil. His whereabouts and corpse were only found in 1985 when German police finally located his corpse and exhumed it 34 years after his escape. And in 1992, DNA evidence proved it was indeed the remains of the elusive Dr. Josef Mengele. Ultimately, I believe Dr. Mengele should and would have been tried and executed for his war crimes, along with the other German physicians at the Nuremberg trials, had he not eluded his capture. 23 other German physicians had been tried for war crimes related to their medical research at the Nuremberg trials, and 7 of them were executed, and likely being that he was such a prominent member and chief camp physician, he also would have been tried and executed. Ultimately, if someone were to do these same experiments today, I think they would still be tried and executed as other similar German physicians were, because of the nature of his experiments were so horrifying, and he had no regard for human life or human efficacy in the medical experiments. And I would hope that if such an obstruction of justice and such horrifying acts were committed today, that unlike him, he wouldn't escape and he would be tried for his crimes.